What's hiding behind a millionaire who marries but never touches his wife? 2 years of marriage, 2 years of distance, until true love breaks every barrier. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to discover this mystery, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. This story will move you. The morning after their second wedding anniversary, Mary awoke once more to an empty bed, the immaculate Egyptian cotton sheets beside her showing no trace that another person had shared this space. The silence of the 19th century brownstone resonated like a silent scream, while the scent of Frank's sandalwood and cedar cologne still lingered in the hallways adorned with antique moldings, reminding her that her millionaire husband had left before sunrise, avoiding yet another day of never-crossing glances and conversations that never took place. Sometimes the hardest walls to tear down aren't made of stone, but the ones we build around our hearts, she thought, watching the Manhattan sunlight filter through the cream silk curtains. Mary sat on the windowsill, observing the carefully maintained gardens where gardeners already busied themselves among rose bushes and ornamental trees. The New York sky stretched above her, a crystalline blue that seemed to mock the coldness of her married life. At 26, she was the envied wife of Frank Bedford, one of the most respected businessmen in America, yet she had never felt so alone. The marriage had begun as an elegant arrangement at St. Patrick's Cathedral, filled with white lilies and empty promises. He, Frank Bedford, a meticulous 40-year-old entrepreneur who owned a fortune built on Napa Valley vineyards and Manhattan real estate investments, wore an Italian linen suit that cost more than what many earned in years. She, Mary Collins, wore a delicate lace gown that seemed to float as she walked down the aisle, her honey-colored eyes bright with naive hope that perhaps this serious-faced man with the tense jaw might learn to love her. "You may kiss the bride," the priest had announced, and when Frank's lips briefly touched hers, it was like kissing the cold marble of the Metropolitan Museum sculptures. Now 2 years later, Mary contemplated her reflection in the antique mirror of her dressing table. Who was this sad-eyed woman staring back at her? Where had the hopeful girl she once was gone? She descended the marble staircase, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness of the home. Elizabeth, the New England cook, was already preparing breakfast in the blue and white tiled kitchen. "Good morning, Mrs. Bedford," Elizabeth said with a warm smile that contrasted with the coolness of the surroundings. "I've made fresh scones and coffee just how you like it." "Thank you, Elizabeth," Mary replied, grateful for this small human warmth. "Mr. Bedford left early this morning," the cook continued, pouring coffee into a fine porcelain cup. "He said he had an important meeting at the offices on Fifth Avenue." Like every morning, thought Mary, but she simply nodded. The ritual was always the same. Frank disappeared before she woke, returned only late in the evening, and they lived like two strangers sharing the same roof, but never the same world. In the gardens, Mary sat on a stone bench near the murmuring fountain. The water droplets danced in the morning sunlight, creating tiny ephemeral rainbows. She took from her bag a book of Whitman's poetry, a rare gift from Frank, the only proof that he sometimes listened to her, and immersed herself in the melancholic verses that echoed her own sadness. "How long will I continue this charade?" she wondered, as she absently turned the yellowed pages. "How long can one live without true love?" The answer remained suspended in the air, as elusive as the scent of the roses blooming all around her. In the months following their marriage, Mary discovered that Frank was generous with everything except his presence. Unlimited credit cards from J.P. Morgan appeared in blue velvet boxes. Jewelry from Tiffany & Co. arrived in luxurious packaging, with no cards. A new silver Mercedes waited in the garage on an ordinary Tuesday morning. But he never dined with her, never asked how her day had been, never sat in the inner courtyard where she spent her afternoons reading, the golden light illuminating the pages, while she pretended not to wait for the sound of his footsteps on the uneven cobblestones. That April morning, 3 months after their wedding anniversary, a new package awaited Mary on the Georgian console table in the entrance hall. A rectangular box from the famous Cartier jewelry store, wrapped in emblematic red paper and tied with a golden ribbon. Mary opened it without enthusiasm, discovering a diamond and sapphire necklace that should have taken her breath away. Instead, she felt a familiar emptiness. These cold stones would never replace the warmth of a real conversation, an attentive look and affectionate touch. "It's magnificent, isn't it, ma'am?" said Jennifer, the housekeeper, who was passing with a bouquet of fresh flowers for the living room. "Mr. Bedford really has good taste." "Yes, it's stunning," Mary replied automatically, closing the case with a sharp snap that echoed in the hall like a sentence. That evening, she decided to wear the necklace for dinner, even though she knew Frank probably wouldn't return. She put on a simple black dress that showcased the precious stones and went down to the dining room with its antique wooden paneling and imposing crystal chandelier. As expected, she dined alone, the necklace sparkling in the candlelight, but with no one to admire it. Peter, the butler, served the dishes with dignified restraint, carefully avoiding commenting on the perpetual absence of the master. "Is there anything else I can bring you, ma'am?" he asked when Mary had barely touched the dessert, a raspberry tart prepared by Elizabeth. "No, thank you, Peter. You may go." Left alone, Mary did something she had never dared to do before. She headed toward Frank's study, an austere room with walls covered in rare books and masterful paintings, where he spent the little time he devoted to the house. The room smelled of his cologne, sandalwood, cedar, and a hint of citrus, and of the leather of the club chairs. Mary turned on the bronze lamp on the massive desk and observed this forbidden space, neatly stacked documents, a Mont Blanc fountain pen precisely placed on a leather desk pad. Not a photo, not a personal object that would reveal the man behind the mask. She gently opened a drawer, then another, seeking what exactly? An explanation? A clue about this man she had married but didn't really know? In the third drawer she found a leather-bound diary. Opening it, she discovered Frank's elegant and precise handwriting. Mainly business notes, figures, names of colleagues and competitors. Nothing personal, except on the date of their wedding. A simple sentence written in different ink as if added later. "Today I married Mary Collins. She deserves better than me." Mary closed the diary, troubled by this unexpected confession. What did that sentence mean? Why did Frank think she deserved better? And why then had he married her? She left the study carrying more questions than answers, the weight of the necklace suddenly as heavy as her thoughts. 3 months after the wedding, during a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where all the couples of New York high society paraded with their performative love, a silver-haired lady wearing a black lace mantilla drew Mary aside and whispered with false concern, "My dear, everyone knows that Frank has never been seen showing affection in public. They say his heart turned to stone long ago, since that terrible affair with the woman from Boston." Mary felt her blood freeze in her veins, but she maintained an impassive expression, as she had learned to do since entering this world of facades and secrets. "I'm not sure I understand what you're talking about, Mrs. Layton," she replied politely but firmly. The old lady smiled, a predatory smile that didn't reach her piercing eyes. "Oh, you didn't know? 5 years ago in Boston, a certain Sophie, but perhaps I should keep quiet. It's not my place to tell others' stories." Mary looked across the room, where Frank was talking with men in dark suits, a glass of champagne in hand, as distant and inaccessible as always. Who was this Sophie? What had happened in Boston? "Excuse me," she said to Mrs. Layton. "I must rejoin my husband." She crossed the room, aware of the curious glances that followed her. The young wife of the mysterious Frank Bedford, the man no one ever really saw smile, the man whose marriage had become a subject of speculation in New York salons. "Frank," she said, arriving at his side, "would you accompany me for a moment? I'd like to see the new Impressionist exhibition." He looked at her with surprise. She rarely asked for anything in public, but nodded politely. "Of course." In the adjacent gallery, surrounded by Monets and Renoirs, by touches of color that captured light and emotion in a way their marriage never had, Mary dared to ask the question, "Who is Sophie?" Frank froze, his face becoming as pale as the immaculate shirt he wore under his tuxedo. His green eyes, usually so controlled, darkened with an emotion she had never seen before. "Who told you about her?" he asked in a low voice, tense as a violin string about to break. "Does it matter?" Mary replied. "What matters is that strangers seem to know more about my husband than I do." Frank looked around as if to ensure they were alone, then fixed his gaze on a Degas painting depicting dancers. "This is neither the time nor the place." "It's never the time nor the place with you," Mary murmured, the pain piercing through her usually controlled voice. "When would it be appropriate to talk about our marriage? About this wall you've built between us?" "Mary, please," and he began, but she interrupted him. No, Frank, I've accepted your distance. I've accepted living like a ghost in your life. But I won't accept being humiliated by gossip that I'm the last to know about. She turned away, ready to leave, when his hand caught her wrist, the first physical contact he had initiated in months. "Wait," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her stop. "I promise we'll talk about it." "But not here. Not now." Mary looked at his hand on her wrist, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers, an almost forgotten sensation. Then she raised her eyes to his face and saw, perhaps for the first time, a crack in the mask of indifference he always wore. "All right," she said finally. "Tonight, when we get home." He nodded, releasing her slowly, as if reluctantly. "Tonight." They returned to the gala, resuming their roles as the perfect husband and wife, but something had changed. A promise hovered between them, as fragile as a rose petal, but just as real. The car rolled in silence through the streets of New York, the city lights reflecting off the gleaming Mercedes. Mary looked out the window, watching the illuminated landmarks pass by like golden ghosts. The Empire State Building sparkling, Fifth Avenue lined with trees, the majestic Flatiron Building. Beside her, Frank remained silent, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road. The tension between them was palpable, like electricity before a storm. When they finally arrived at the brownstone, Mary almost expected him to find an excuse to avoid their promised conversation. But after handing his keys to the butler, he turned to her. "Meet me in the library in 15 minutes, he said, in a low, almost hesitant voice. "I think we'll need a drink for this discussion." Mary went up to her room, her heart pounding with apprehension. She removed her evening gown and put on a simple silk blouse and flowing pants. In front of her mirror, she observed her reflection, wondering if this night would mark a turning point in their marriage, or further deepen the gap between them. When she entered the library with its walls covered in antique books, Frank was standing in front of the marble fireplace, a glass of cognac in his hand. He offered her another, a glass of red wine that she recognized as a Cabernet from his own vineyards. "Please sit down," he said, indicating one of the leather armchairs arranged in front of the hearth where a gentle fire burned despite the mildness of the evening. Mary sat down, observing this man she had married but barely knew. In the subdued light of the library, his usually closed face seemed more vulnerable, the shadows highlighting the lines of fatigue around his eyes and mouth. "You asked who Sophie is," he began, staring at the flames rather than her face. "It's a story I would prefer to forget, but it seems the past always catches up with us in one way or another." He took a sip of cognac as if to give himself courage, then continued, 5 years ago, I met Sophie Hartman in Boston. She was dazzling, intelligent, charming, or at least that's what I believed." His voice hardened slightly, betraying an old but still vivid pain. "We got engaged quickly. I was madly in love. I gave her everything. My time, my trust, my heart. And she took far more than that." He finally turned to Mary, and she was struck by the intensity of his gaze. "Sophie betrayed me in the worst possible way. She made me believe she was pregnant to extort money from me. She sold confidential information about my businesses to my competitors, and when I confronted her, she laughed. She told me that rich men were nothing but walking safes, and that I had been the easiest to open because I had been foolish enough to truly love her." Mary felt her heart tighten at the evident pain in his voice. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "No one deserves to be treated like that." Frank gave a bitter laugh. "After that, I swore I would never again allow someone to get close enough to destroy me that way. Business was safe, predictable, controllable. But emotions—" He shook his head as if to chase away an unpleasant memory. "So why did you marry me?" Mary asked softly, finally posing the question that had haunted her for months. Frank put down his glass and approached the window, contemplating the garden immersed in darkness. "My family insisted that I settle down. The Bedford lineage, respectability, all those considerations that seem so important in our circles. And then, I met you." He turned toward her, and for the first time she saw real vulnerability in his eyes. "You were different, sweet, authentic, someone who I thought wouldn't try to manipulate me. So I proposed this marriage, telling myself it was a practical arrangement, that I could maintain emotional distance while fulfilling my social obligations. Mary felt tears come to her eyes, hurt by this cold analysis of their union. "But I've been cruelly unfair," he continued, his voice softening. "You don't deserve to be punished for crimes another committed, and every day I realize how much I hurt you with my distance." He approached her, kneeling near her armchair, in a gesture that surprised her with its humility. "I don't know if I can change, Mary. I don't know if I can give you what you deserve, but I wanted you to understand why things are the way they are between us." Mary looked at this powerful man, now vulnerable before her, and felt something open in her heart. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps understanding. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply, briefly touching his hand in a gesture of acceptance. That night, for the first time since their marriage, they parted not as strangers, but as two people each carrying their own wounds, finally looking in the same direction, toward a difficult but shared truth. It was after that night of confessions that the first small change occurred. Mary found a package on her antique dressing table. Inside was a rare book of Emily Dickinson poetry that she had mentioned months earlier. During a breakfast conversation, she thought he wasn't listening to as he read the Wall Street Journal. There was no card, but the message was clear. He was attentive, even when he pretended not to be. Mary caressed the leather cover of the collection, feeling beneath her fingers the grain of the ancient material and the golden letters of the title. She carefully opened the book, breathing in the particular smell of pages yellowed by time, and discovered an inscription in blue ink on the first page. "The words of poets sometimes say what we ourselves dare not express. F." This simple phrase, these few words traced in his elegant hand, made her heart beat faster than all the expensive jewelry he had previously given her. It was little, and yet it was everything, a first step towards something real. That morning, when she went down for breakfast, Frank was still there, contrary to his habit of leaving before dawn. He was still reading the Wall Street Journal, but when she entered the sun-filled dining room, he lowered his newspaper slightly and looked at her. "Good morning," he said simply. "Good morning," Mary replied, surprised by his presence. "Thank you for the book. It's a wonderful gift." He nodded, an indecipherable expression in his green eyes. "I thought you would like it." A silence settled between them, but for the first time it wasn't a silence of emptiness and distance. It was a silence of hesitation, of possibilities, like the space between two musical notes that announces the continuation of a melody. "I have an important meeting today," he finally said, carefully folding his newspaper. "A new real estate development project in Greenwich Village." Mary poured herself a cup of coffee, appreciating this rare moment of morning conversation. "It's a beautiful neighborhood. I like to walk there sometimes, watching the artists in Washington Square Park." Frank seemed to hesitate, then added, "Perhaps you could give me your opinion on the plans. You have a good eye for details I sometimes overlook." Mary looked at him, surprised by this unexpected invitation to enter his professional world. "I'd like that." When he rose to leave, he did something he had never done before. He approached her and, after a moment of hesitation, lightly touched her shoulder with his hand. "Until tonight, then," he said, and she felt the warmth of that simple contact long after he had left the room. That day, Mary went as usual to the community center in Greenwich Village, where she taught reading to children from immigrant families. But something had changed in her. A small light of hope had been lit, fragile as a candle flame in the wind, but real. "Mrs. Bedford, you're smiling today," exclaimed Fatima, a little girl with tight braids and eyes bright with intelligence. Mary hadn't realized she was smiling. "That's because I received a special gift this morning," she replied, holding close the book of Emily Dickinson she had brought to read to the older children. "A gift from your husband?" asked Fatima, with the innocent curiosity of children. "Yes, from my husband," confirmed Mary, realizing with surprise that it was the first time she had spoken of Frank to the children. "He must love you very much," declared Fatima, with the certainty of those who have not yet learned to doubt love. Mary didn't answer, but these words resonated in her throughout the day. Is it possible that despite his distance, despite the walls he has built, Frank feels something for me? That evening, when she returned home, she found Frank in his study, surrounded by plans and documents. He looked up when she entered, and she thought she saw the shadow of a smile cross his usually impassive face. "You're back," he said, as if he had been waiting for her. "Come see these plans." She approached the desk, aware of his proximity as he showed her the architectural drawings of the Greenwich Village project. Their professional discussion gradually transformed into a more personal conversation about the neighborhood, about the artists who lived there, about the cafes she liked to frequent. "You seem to love that place," he observed, watching her speak animatedly about the cobblestone streets and the views of New York. "I love its authenticity," Mary explained. "It's one of the few neighborhoods in New York that has kept its soul, that isn't just a postcard for tourists." Frank looked at her for a long time, as if he was really seeing her for the first time. "You're like that too, aren't you? Authentic, unpretentious. It's refreshing in our world." Mary felt her cheeks flush under this new gaze, under this unexpected compliment. "Thank you," she murmured, not knowing what else to say. That night, preparing for sleep, Mary opened the book of Emily Dickinson again and came across a poem delicately underlined in pencil. "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all." She ran her fingers over the underlined lines, wondering when Frank had marked this passage and what it meant to him. A hope that resembled her. Was it possible that he was seeking in her a refuge from the harshness of the world that had hurt him? For the first time in a long time, Mary fell asleep with a feeling of hope. The poetry book held against her heart like a fragile but real promise. The 6th month of marriage had brought Mary's birthday, a date she had mentioned only once, without expectations. When she woke up, the house was in absolute silence. Frank had already left for the offices on 5th Avenue. No lilies, no note, no sign that the day meant anything. She had spent the whole day on the balcony overlooking Central Park, watching the garden with meticulously maintained orange trees and jasmine, tears flowing silently as the sun crossed the New York sky. In the evening, alone at the dining table under the crystal chandelier, she ate the apple tart that Elizabeth, the New England cook, had prepared out of pity for her, each bite tasting of solitude. Now, a year later, as her birthday approached again, Mary hoped for nothing different. Despite the small changes in their relationship since the night of confessions, despite the moments of real conversation and the glances that lasted a bit longer, Frank remained largely a mystery, a man who maintained his emotional distance like armor. The eve of her birthday, Mary was dining alone as usual, listening to the spring rain gently hitting the dining room windows, when Frank entered, an event rare enough to make her look up in surprise. "I wasn't expecting you for dinner," she said, putting down her fork. He stood in the doorway, almost hesitant. "I finished earlier than expected at the office." Mary noticed he was holding an envelope. "Is there a problem?" she asked, accustomed to the rare communications between them concerning practical matters. Frank approached the table, pulling out a chair to sit across from her, a proximity that seemed both strange yet natural. "No, no problem," he said, placing the envelope on the table between them. It's your birthday." Mary felt her heart leap in her chest. He remembered. After forgetting it the previous year, this time he remembered. "Yes," she replied simply, not wanting to betray the emotion that this simple acknowledgement stirred in her. "I won't be here tomorrow," he continued, and she felt her heart fall just as quickly. "I have a business trip to Boston that can't be postponed." Boston, the city where Sophie had betrayed him. Mary wondered whether the choice of this destination on this particular date was deliberate or simply a cruel coincidence. "I understand," she said, lowering her eyes to her half-empty plate. "But I have—" Frank pushed the envelope toward her. "I have something for you. For tomorrow." Mary looked at the envelope, then raised her eyes to him, surprised by this gesture. "What is it?" "Open it tomorrow," he said. "Not before, please." There was an intensity in his voice, an urgency that made her curious. She nodded, accepting his request. "I have to leave early," he added, rising. "Sleep well, Mary." "Safe travels," she replied, watching his elegant silhouette disappear down the hallway. That night, Mary couldn't sleep, the envelope placed on her antique bedside table seeming to call to her. What did it contain? A cold, formal birthday card? A check? Another impersonal gift showing he knew the date, but not really the person she was? On the morning of her birthday, she woke with the sun, alone in the large, silent house. Frank had left, as he had announced. She took the envelope, examining it as if she could guess its contents. Then, with trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside, she found not a card, but a key, a simple brass key, attached to a tag with an address in Greenwich Village, near the community centre where she taught, and a note handwritten by Frank. Mary, for your birthday, I thought of giving you not an object but a space, a place that belongs to you where you can be entirely yourself. The enclosed address is that of a small apartment in the neighbourhood you love so much. It's in your name, furnished according to your tastes. Elizabeth helped me choose, and it's there for you when you need it. Whether for a quiet afternoon, after your work at the centre, or for longer, if life in our house becomes too stifling. I know I haven't been the husband you deserve. I'm not sure I can ever be. But I want to at least give you the freedom you deserve. Happy birthday. Frank. Mary read the letter several times, tears blurring her vision. This was no ordinary gift. It was both an acknowledgement of his failure as a husband and a gesture of freedom that touched her deeply. He was offering her an escape, a refuge, without trying to hold her back. Later that day, she went to the indicated address and discovered a charming apartment under the roofs of New York, with windows overlooking Washington Square and the Empire State Building. The space was small but perfect. Walls painted in the soft tones she preferred, shelves filled with books she loved, a small balcony with pots of lavender and rosemary. On the kitchen table, she found another envelope. Inside, a simple birthday card with a message that made her cry again. This place is yours and yours alone. Use it as you see fit. I will never ask you for an accounting. I just want you to know that wherever you choose to be, I will always think of you. With sincere affection, Frank. Mary sat on the small sofa, looking around at this space that belonged to her, this gift that was both a liberation and a confession. For the first time since their marriage, she felt she had a real choice. And for the first time, too, she understood that behind Frank's cold facade was a man capable of true empathy and generosity. She stayed in the apartment until evening, savouring the freedom of this space, then returned to the brownstone carrying her decision like a precious secret in her heart. A year after the wedding, Frank's business suffered a brutal crisis. Furious Boston investors. Headlines in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal questioning his integrity, threatening lawsuits related to fraud in his vineyards. For the first time, Mary saw him vulnerable. He returned home one Tuesday evening, his Italian silk tie loosened, his green eyes reddened, his shoulders bent under the weight of something money couldn't solve. Mary was in the kitchen with its colonial-style mouldings, preparing a chamomile tea, the steam from the infusion rising in lazy spirals. Without thinking, she served him a cup. He accepted, sat on one of the dark wooden chairs, and for the first time in 12 months, they talked. Not about love or marriage, but about business and strategies. Mary, a Harvard Business School graduate but never taken seriously, asked intelligent questions in her soft voice. She pointed out flaws he hadn't considered, suggested creative solutions based on practices she had studied. At 3 in the morning, they were still in the kitchen, papers scattered on the marble table, cold coffee forgotten in cups. And when Frank finally looked up at her, there was something different in his gaze. Surprise, respect, perhaps even gratitude. "I didn't know you understood business at this level," he admitted, rubbing his tired eyes. Mary smiled slightly. "There are many things you don't know about me, Frank, just as there are many things I don't know about you." He looked at her for a long time, as if truly becoming aware of her presence for the first time. "I would like to know more," he said finally, in a voice so low she barely heard him. The following days were intense. Frank spent hours on the phone, had emergency meetings with his lawyers and associates. But every evening he came home and sought out Mary, sharing with her the day's developments, listening to her advice, working together on strategies to save his company. One evening, as they sat in the library surrounded by documents and financial reports, Frank put down his pen and looked at Mary with an expression she had never seen before. "Why are you helping me?" he asked suddenly. "After everything I've put you through, or rather everything I haven't done for you, why do you care about my problems?" Mary thought for a moment before answering, carefully choosing her words. "Because despite everything, you're my husband, And because I believe that beneath that armor you wear there's a good man who's been deeply hurt." Frank looked away, visibly moved by her response. "You're too generous, Mary. I've been a bad husband." "Perhaps," she conceded gently. "But we're both prisoners of this marriage, aren't we? You of your past fears and I of my future hopes." He looked at her with a new intensity. "What are they, these hopes?" Mary hesitated, then decided to risk the truth. "In the beginning, I hoped you would love me. Then I hoped you would simply notice me. Now I just hope we can find a way to be honest with each other." A silence fell between them, but it wasn't the cold silence of before. It was a silence charged with possibilities, with unspoken truths finally acknowledged. "I do notice you, Mary," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I've always noticed you. It's just that I didn't know how to be with you, how to be with anyone after what happened." That night marked a turning point. The walls Frank had built began slowly to crumble, not in a great dramatic gesture, but in small moments of honesty and shared vulnerability. The following months brought a subtle but undeniable change. He started coming home earlier from the office. He inquired about her volunteer work at the community center. Sometimes they dined together, enjoying roast beef and clam chowder, practical conversations about social events and engagements. But it was already something, more than the nothingness of before. One Sunday morning, Frank suggested something unexpected. "I'd like to see this community center where you teach. If you agree, of course." Mary was surprised by this request. "Really? Why?" "Because it's important to you," he replied simply, "and I'd like to understand why." The next day, they went together to the center in Greenwich Village. Mary watched Frank, usually so at ease in luxurious boardrooms, navigate with a certain awkwardness in this simple, lively environment. He looked at everything with curiosity: the modest classrooms, the children's drawings hanging on the walls, the small worn desks. When the children arrived, Mary saw something remarkable. Frank, the severe and reserved businessman, kneeling to talk to a small Syrian boy, who proudly showed him a book he had learned to read. The expression on his face was transformed, gentle, attentive, almost wonderstruck. "Has he learned all this thanks to you?" he asked Mary later, as they walked through the cobblestone streets of Greenwich Village. "Not just thanks to me," she replied modestly. "We're several volunteers. But yes, I've worked with Amir since he arrived." Frank stopped, looking at the Empire State Building rising majestically above them. "You're making a real difference in their lives," he said, with sincere admiration in his voice. It's more important than anything I do with my millions." Mary looked at him, touched by this acknowledgement. "Everyone contributes in their own way, Frank. Your companies create jobs, fund important projects." He shook his head. "It's not the same. What you do here is direct, personal. You give a part of yourself, not just your money or your time." That day marked another subtle change. Frank began to take an interest in the center, making anonymous donations, suggesting improvements for the facilities, and more importantly, he began to look at Mary differently, with new respect, an admiration that went beyond simple courtesy. The distance between them diminished day by day, conversation after conversation. It wasn't yet love, not yet the relationship she had hoped for at the beginning, but it was a start, a real beginning. Then came the obligatory trip, a business conference in the Hamptons on Long Island, where she had to accompany him for image purposes. 5 days in a luxury hotel with a view of the Atlantic, where finally there were no long hallways separating their rooms. Just a thin wall between the master bedroom with a sea view and the improvised office where he insisted on sleeping on the leather sofa. Mary stood on the balcony of their suite, watching the sun set over the sea, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The sea breeze played with strands of her hair, bringing with it the salty scents of the Atlantic. Behind her she could hear Frank on the phone, his low voice discussing the last details of tomorrow's conference. She hadn't wanted to come initially, preferring the tranquility of her small apartment in Greenwich Village to this facade of a perfect couple they had to maintain in public. But Frank had insisted, not with authority as before, but with a kind of pleading in his eyes. "I would like you to come," he had said. "People talk when you're not there." She had accepted, not for appearances, but because something in his voice suggested he truly wanted her presence. Now, as night fell over the Hamptons, Mary wondered if she had made the right choice. The day had been filled with exhausting social interactions, forced smiles, superficial conversations, curious glances from other wives who always wondered what was the secret of the mysterious Bedford couple. "Is everything all right?" Frank's voice startled her. She hadn't heard him approach. "Yes," she replied, turning slightly toward him. "It's just tiring sometimes. All these people pretending to know us, judging us without knowing." Frank leaned against the railing beside her, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body, but not close enough to touch. That cautious distance he always maintained. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I know it's not easy for you. These events, these people." "That's not what's difficult," Mary admitted, daring a honesty she wouldn't have risked a few months earlier. "It's pretending to be something we're not. A couple." Frank remained silent for a long time, watching the lights that began to twinkle along the Hamptons shoreline. "We are a couple, Mary," he said finally. "Maybe not like the others. Maybe not like we should have been. But we are connected in some way." She turned her head to look at him, surprised by this admission. "Is that enough for you?" she asked. "This limited connection we have." Frank looked at her, and in the fading light his eyes seemed more vulnerable than she had ever seen them. "No," he confessed. "It's not enough, but it's all I know how to give for now." The third night, after a formal dinner where all the other couples danced the waltz and tango, Mary stood on the hotel balcony, the Atlantic wind tousling her dark brown hair, the lights of the Hampton shores shining like earthly stars. She didn't hear Frank approach. When she sensed his presence, her heart skipped a beat. "You dance very well," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, the New York accent charged with contained emotion. "I noticed when you danced with that Boston businessman. You have a natural grace." She turned to him, surprised by the sudden use of informal language, this verbal intimacy he had never used before. "I didn't know you were paying attention." "I always pay attention to you," he replied, and there was a pain in his voice she didn't understand. "Since the first day." It was then that Mary decided to confront him. "Then why do you act as if I don't exist? Why do you keep me at a distance? Why did you marry me if you can't even look at me?" Frank remained silent for so long that she thought he would simply walk away, as he always did. But then he began to speak, and the story that emerged broke her heart in a way no indifference had ever done. 5 years earlier in Boston, he had loved a woman, Sophie, a Boston woman with blue eyes who had sworn eternal love while systematically emptying his accounts at Chase Manhattan, who had feigned a pregnancy to extort money, who had sold information about the vineyards and real estate investments to competitors in New York. When Frank discovered it, she had laughed and told him that rich men were nothing but walking safes, and that he had been the easiest to open because he had been foolish enough to truly love her. "I swore I would never again allow someone to get close enough to destroy me like that," he confessed, his hands gripping the balcony railing so tightly his knuckles whitened. "I married you because my family demanded that I settle down. Because you seemed sweet and innocent, someone who wouldn't try to manipulate me. But the more time passes, the more I realize I'm being cruelly unfair. You don't deserve to be punished for crimes another committed." Mary felt tears burning her eyes. "Do you think it's been easy for me? Living like a ghost in your life? Being treated like a business obligation?" "I know," he said, finally turning to her. And in his eyes, for the first time, she saw real emotion, guilt, remorse, and something deeper she didn't dare name. "And I'm sorry, but I'm also terrified, because lately when I come home and you're not there, the house seems emptier than ever. When you smile at those children at the community center, I feel jealousy. When you're close, I have to force myself to keep my distance, because if I don't, I... He didn't finish his sentence, but he didn't need to. She understood. That night in the hotel room in the Hamptons, something changed between them. Not a grand romantic gesture, not a moment of cinematic passion, just a hand extended in the night, finding another hand. Just two wounded people finally beginning to see each other for real, to accept themselves as they were. Imperfect, afraid, but perhaps, just perhaps, capable of loving despite everything. The following months were different. Frank still maintained a certain distance, but now there was a tension in the air, like an elastic stretched to its limit. He began to briefly touch her hand when they passed each other in the cobblestoned courtyard. She began to leave notes in his briefcase. Small gestures, cautious attempts to build bridges over the abyss he had created. Mary found herself more and more often in that strange territory between hope and resignation. The changes in Frank's behavior were real, small attentions, questions about her day, a more constant presence in their shared life. But was it enough? Could she really build a life on these crumbs of affection, on these hesitant gestures? One autumn afternoon, as the golden leaves fell in the brownstones' garden, Mary was looking for a book in the library when she noticed something strange. Behind a first edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass was an olive wood box that seemed deliberately hidden. Driven by a curiosity she would never have dared satisfy before, Mary took the box and opened it carefully. Inside, she discovered letters. Dozens of them. Letters Frank had written to her during the 2 years of their marriage, intimate confessions in his elegant handwriting that had never been sent. With a beating heart, Mary sat in an armchair near the window and began to read. Each letter was dated starting right after their wedding. My dear Mary, today you smiled while looking at the roses in the garden, and I had to leave the room because that smile did something to my heart that I'm not ready to face. How can I tell you that every time you're happy, I feel my resolution weaken? How can I explain to you that I live in constant terror of letting you in, of trusting you, and discovering that you're like her? But you're not like her, are you? You stay despite my coldness. You create beauty in this empty house. You give without asking for anything in return. I'm a coward, Mary. I write you letters I'll never send. I keep my feelings locked in a box like a shameful secret. Perhaps one day I'll find the courage. Perhaps one day I'll know how to love you openly. Frank. Mary moved on to the more recent letters, her hands trembling. Mary. Today, at the community center, I saw how those children look at you with so much love and trust. I understood then what I've been denying you for so long, the chance to be loved for the extraordinary person you are. Every day, I struggle against the urge to go to your room at night, to wake you and tell you all these things I keep locked inside. That when you speak, I hear music, that when you read in the garden, the light around you seems brighter, that despite all my efforts to remain detached, I've fallen in love with my own wife like a teenager, awkwardly, completely, desperately. But fear still paralyzes me. The fear that once I've given you my heart entirely, you'll discover it's not worth keeping. The fear that love is just an illusion we tell ourselves so we're not alone. I'm sorry for being so weak, Mary. You deserve so much more than the crumbs I offer you. Frank. Tears fell on the aged pages, staining the blue ink of the confessions he had never had the courage to make aloud. And something in Mary broke. She couldn't take it anymore. It didn't matter that he loved her in secret if he could never show it. She deserved more than a love locked in unsent letters. In a state of emotional clarity she had never known before, Mary carefully put the letters back in the box, replaced it behind the books, and went up to her room. There, with hands that no longer trembled, she began to pack her bags. She took only the essentials, some clothes, books she cherished, photos of her family. The rest belonged to that life she was leaving behind, that life of cold luxury and golden solitude. On the dining room table, next to a vase of red lilies that Elizabeth had arranged that morning, Mary left a simple note. I love you, but I can't continue to be loved only on paper. When you're ready to love me in real life, I'll be waiting. Mary. She added the address of her small apartment in Greenwich Village, the one Frank had given her for her birthday, then quietly left the brownstone, her heart heavy but resolved. That evening, she settled into her modest apartment under the roofs of New York, listening to the autumn rain against the mansard windows and the sounds of real life in the street below. Laughter, conversations, music coming from a nearby cafe. For the first time in a long time, despite the pain and uncertainty, she felt strangely free. Sometimes, she thought, watching the city lights twinkle through the rain, you have to have the courage to leave so that the other finds the courage to follow you. The separation lasted 2 months that seemed like 2 years. Frank made no attempt to contact her, and Mary moved to her small apartment in Greenwich Village near the community center, continuing her volunteer work and trying to rebuild a life she had never truly lived. The first days were strangely calm. Mary had expected to feel overwhelming grief, but instead discovered a sort of melancholic peace. Her small apartment quickly became a sanctuary, a space where she could be entirely herself without having to constantly navigate the icy waters of Frank's indifference. She established new routines. In the morning, she prepared her own coffee in a small French press, savoring the simple ritual that no one else performed for her. She walked to the community center, breathing in the crisp New York autumn air, watching the red and gold leaves swirl in the cobblestone streets. "Where is your husband?" Fatima, the bright-eyed little girl she had taught for months, asked one day. Mary hesitated, searching for an appropriate answer for a child. "He's in our other house," she said finally. "Sometimes adults need space to think." "Do you miss him?" Fatima persisted with children's frankness. Mary smiled gently. "Yes, I miss him, but sometimes you have to be away from someone to see them better." Fatima frowned, confused by this adult concept, then shrugged and returned to her book, leaving Mary with her thoughts. On weekends, Mary explored New York as she never had before. Not as the wife of a millionaire who moved around in a chauffeured Mercedes, but as a simple New Yorker. She spent hours at the Brooklyn flea market, rummaging among forgotten treasures and dusty antiques. She strolled in Central Park, feeding the ducks and watching old gentlemen play chess. Once she thought she glimpsed Frank, an elegant figure in a dark suit crossing Washington Square Park. Her heart stopped for a moment, but the man turned around, revealing a stranger's face, and she continued on her way, a mixture of relief and disappointment in her chest. The nights were harder. Lying in her simple bed under the exposed beams of the mansard apartment, Mary often wondered if she had made the right choice. Perhaps she should have stayed, accepted the small changes in their relationship as sufficient victories. Perhaps she was too demanding, expecting Frank to heal deep wounds simply because she wanted him to. Then she remembered the letters, those pages and pages of confined love, of real emotions he felt, but had never had the courage to express. No, she had made the right choice. True love couldn't exist in the shadows, in the unspoken. It had to breathe, live in the daylight, be risked and vulnerable. One morning, Mary received an unexpected call from Elizabeth, the cook at the brownstone. "Mrs. Bedford," said the warm voice of the New Englander on the phone, "I just wanted to check on you, see if you needed anything." "That's kind of you, Elizabeth," Mary replied, touched by this attention. "I'm fine. The apartment is small but comfortable. And Mr. Bedford," Elizabeth hesitated, "he doesn't mind me calling you?" Mary smiled sadly. "No, of course not. How is he?" A brief silence at the other end of the line. "He's different, Mum. He comes home early now, but he hardly eats anything I prepare. He spends hours in your room, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking out the window. I heard him talking to Peter about selling the house." Mary felt her heart tighten at this news. "Selling the house? But it's been in his family for generations. He says it's too empty now," Elizabeth continued, her voice low as if sharing a secret. "Too full of ghosts, those are his words." After this call, Mary spent several days in a state of agitation. Should she contact Frank? Let him know she was thinking of him? No, she had promised herself to hold firm, to wait for him to take the first step toward true vulnerability, toward emotional honesty. Time passed, marked by moments of alternating doubt and conviction. Winter settled over New York, enveloping the city in a crystalline cold that seemed to reflect the state of Mary's heart, both clear in its resolution and painful in its solitude. Then, on a rainy spring afternoon, when she returned home soaked and exhausted after a particularly difficult day, Frank was waiting at the door of the old building. He stood there in the rain without an umbrella, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his shoulders hunched in a way she had never seen before. Nothing of the usual impeccable Armani suit. Just jeans and a white linen shirt, disheveled hair, the red eyes of someone who hadn't slept for weeks. Mary stopped short, her own umbrella tilted forward, creating a momentary barrier between them, a last symbolic frontier. "Frank," she said simply, her heart beating so loudly she was sure he could hear it despite the noise of the rain on the cobblestones. "Mary," he replied, his voice hoarse as if he hadn't spoken for a long time. I found your note, and I saw that you had read my letters." She nodded, unable to speak, fearing her voice would betray the emotion rising within her. "I'm ready," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm terrified. I still have nightmares of being used and thrown away. But living without you has been worse than any fear. You're not her, you never were. And I've been a coward not to see it from the beginning." He took a step forward, his hands trembling as he extended them toward her. "Please, teach me to love again. Teach me to trust. I don't know if I can do it perfectly, but I want to try. I need to try. Because you're the best thing that's ever happened to me in my life, and I've spent 2 years wasting it." Mary looked at this powerful man, now broken and vulnerable before her, and saw not the cold New York millionaire she had married, but the real man behind the armor. And when she put her hand in his, feeling the warmth of skin against skin, it was as if the entire world realigned itself. "We'll start slowly," she whispered, and he smiled. A real, genuine smile that lit up his green eyes and transformed his entire face. Slowly is perfect. They began anew. Real walks through the cobblestone streets of New York. Dinners in hidden bistros in the city. Deep conversations about the past and future while walking across the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset. Hesitant touches that gradually became more confident. Mary had decided not to return immediately to the brownstone. She wanted their relationship to rebuild on new foundations, away from the habits and memories that had trapped them in rigid roles. Frank accepted this decision with a humility that still surprised her. He who had always demanded control over every aspect of his life. "I'd like you to come to dinner at my place tonight," Mary proposed one afternoon, as they left the community center where Frank had joined her to help with a reading project. "It won't be as elegant as what you're used to, but I'd love to," he replied without hesitation, with an enthusiasm that made her smile. That evening, in the small kitchen of her apartment under the roofs, Mary prepared a simple mushroom risotto and a salad, while Frank opened a bottle of wine from his own vineyards, a concession to luxury in this modest environment. "It's strange," he said, looking around, observing the walls with slightly peeling paint, the exposed beams, the view of the New York skyline from the mansard window. "I feel more comfortable here than in my house." Mary smiled, stirring the risotto. "Perhaps because here there are no expectations, no ghosts from the past, just us as we are now." He approached her, hesitated for a moment, then gently placed his hands on her shoulders. "And who are we now, Mary?" She turned to face him, aware of his proximity, of the warmth of his hands through the thin fabric of her blouse. "We are two people trying to find their way," she replied softly. "Two people who have been hurt, who are afraid, but who choose to try despite everything." Frank nodded, his green eyes intensely fixed on hers. "I've started therapy," he said, as a confession. "Twice a week, with a psychologist in Manhattan, to work on my trust issues." Mary felt a wave of emotion wash over her. For a man like Frank, admitting he needed help was perhaps the greatest act of courage he could perform. "I'm proud of you," she murmured, raising a hand to touch his cheek, a gesture she would never have dared make in their previous life. He briefly closed his eyes at this contact, as if to savor the sensation. "My therapist says I need to establish healthy boundaries instead of impenetrable walls. That I need to learn to trust gradually, accepting the risk that entails." Mary smiled. "Your therapist seems wise." "She is," Frank agreed. "She also told me something important, that you have the right to establish your own boundaries, that if we try again, you need to tell me clearly what you need, what you expect from me, what you won't tolerate." Mary reflected for a moment, appreciating this invitation to express her needs, something she had never really done in their relationship. "I need honesty," she said finally. "Not just the absence of lies, but active honesty. Your thoughts, your fears, your hopes, I want to know them even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." Frank nodded, encouraging her to continue. "I need to know that you really see me," she continued. "Not as an extension of yourself or as a solution to your loneliness, but as a whole person, with my own dreams and ambitions." "And what won't you tolerate?" he asked softly. "Silence as punishment," Mary replied without hesitation. "Secrets that create walls between us. Indifference. I've lived through 2 years of that, Frank, and I don't want to go back to it." He took her hands in his, a simple but deeply intimate gesture for them. "I promise to try. I can't guarantee I'll never make mistakes, that I'll never fall back into my old habits when I'm afraid. But I promise to try every day, and when I fail, I promise to have the courage to acknowledge it and start again." That night, they dined together at the small table near the window, talking about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their favorite books, their hopes for the future. When the time came to say goodbye, Frank stood awkwardly at the door like a teenager after a first date. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, with a vulnerability that melted Mary's heart. She nodded, and when his lips touched hers, gently, cautiously, as if he feared breaking her, she understood that this was their true first kiss. Not the formal exchange in church on their wedding day, but this authentic moment, freely chosen by two people who were finally beginning to know each other. "Until tomorrow," she murmured when he drew back. "Until tomorrow," he confirmed, and this simple promise seemed to contain an entire universe of possibilities. Together they visited the Napa Valley vineyards that had belonged to the Bedford family for generations. It was a clear early summer day, the sun bathing the endless rows of vines in golden light. Mary watched Frank as he walked among the vines, occasionally touching the green leaves with a familiarity that spoke of a deep connection to this land. "My grandfather always said that the vine is like the human heart," he said, stopping to examine a cluster of still green grapes. "It must be severely pruned to give the best fruit. Too protected, it becomes weak and unproductive." Mary smiled at this analogy. "And what do you think?" Frank reflected for a moment, his face more open, more expressive than she had ever seen it before. "I think he was partially right. We are all shaped by our trials, but I also believe that too much pruning can kill the plant. You have to find the balance. Enough challenge to create strength, enough care to allow growth." They continued their walk, arriving at an old stone cabin in the middle of the vineyard. Frank took out a key and opened the weather-worn wooden door. "This was my father's refuge," he explained, leading her inside. "The place he came to when the responsibilities of the Bedford family became too heavy." The cabin was simple but charming. Stone walls, some rustic furniture, a fireplace blackened by use. On the walls, black and white photos showed generations of Bedfords working in the vineyards, proudly posing with their harvests. "You look a lot like your father," Mary observed, studying a particular photo of a man with an intense gaze but a warm smile. "Physically, perhaps," Frank said with a touch of sadness, "but he knew how to live, how to love. He adored my mother in a way I could see, feel, even as a child." He sat on a bench near the window, inviting Mary to join him. "It's here, in this cabin, that my father spoke to me for the last time before his death. I was 25, already obsessed with business, determined to prove my worth in terms of financial success." Mary listened attentively, aware that he was sharing something deeply personal, another wall crumbling between them. "He told me I was confusing price and value," Frank continued, "that I was accumulating wealth but neglecting what made life truly rich. At the time, I dismissed his words as those of a man from another generation who didn't understand the modern economy." He looked out the window toward the orderly rows of vines extending to the horizon. "Then I met Sophie, and I believed I could have both, professional success and love. When everything fell apart, I convinced myself that my father was wrong, that love was an illusion, and that only tangible assets had real value." Mary took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "And now," Frank turned to her, his green eyes bright with emotion, "now I wonder if he wasn't right from the beginning. If all these years building walls around my heart, accumulating wealth with no one to truly share it with, haven't been a terrible mistake." Under the centuries-old vines, he finally shared his complete story. Not only Sophie's betrayal, but also his childhood under the weight of Bedford expectations. The early loss of his mother, the complicated relationship with a father he admired but didn't really understand. Mary listened, offering not solutions or judgments, but simply her attentive presence, her silent acceptance of all parts of him, even the darkest. When he finished speaking, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, transforming the vineyards into an undulating sea of gold. "Thank you," he said simply, squeezing her hand. "For what?" she asked. "For listening, for seeing beyond the man I pretended to be, for giving me a chance I probably don't deserve." Mary gently shook her head. "It's not a question of deserving, Frank. Love isn't a reward for good behavior. It's a choice we make every day, despite imperfections, despite fears." He looked at her with an expression of surprise, as if he had just realized something important. Do you love me, Mary?" Even after everything I've put you through." She smiled, gently touching his face. "I loved you when you kept me at a distance. I loved you when I read your never-sent letters. I loved you when I decided to leave, and I love you now as we try to build something new." Frank closed his eyes, as if these words were almost too much to bear. Then, in a movement that seemed both spontaneous and inevitable, he drew her to him, kissing her with a passion and tenderness that spoke of all the unspoken words, of all the emotions contained for so long. When they finally separated, twilight had fallen on the vineyards and something new had begun between them. Not the beginning of their story, but perhaps finally, the true beginning of their love. 6 months passed, marked by progress and setbacks, moments of deep connection, and instants of fear when Frank's old reflexes threatened to resurface. But each time he began to withdraw, to build his walls, he found the courage to admit it, to share his fears with Mary, rather than punishing her with his silence. Frank began to become more involved in the community center, putting his business skills to use in helping obtain grants, improve facilities, create mentorship programs for young adults. It was as if, in opening up to Mary, he had also opened up to the world, rediscovering a capacity for empathy and connection he had buried under years of distrust. Mary, for her part, developed a new confidence in herself. She was no longer just Mrs. Bedford, the decorative wife of a powerful man, but a woman with her own passions and ambitions. She began to write articles on education and social integration, drawing on her experience at the center. Frank encouraged her, proud of her achievements in a way he could never have been before. They still lived separately, Mary in her Greenwich Village apartment, Frank in the brownstone, but they spent most of their evenings together, alternating between the two residences. This arrangement, initially conceived as temporary, had become an important part of their new dynamic, a reminder that they chose to be together from desire rather than obligation. One spring evening, as they dined at a small restaurant near the Hudson River, Frank seemed particularly nervous, playing with his wine glass, starting sentences he abandoned halfway. "What's worrying you?" Mary finally asked, covering his hand with hers. He took a deep breath as if gathering his courage. "I've sold the brownstone," he said at last. Mary looked at him in surprise. "You've sold it? But it's been in the Bedford family for 7 generations, I know," he finished with a slight smile. "That's precisely why I sold it. That house. It represented everything I was supposed to be. The keeper of the Bedford tradition. The perfect heir. The emotionless businessman." He squeezed her hand, his eyes seeking hers. "I don't want to be that man anymore, Mary. I want to be the one I'm becoming with you. Imperfect, vulnerable, but real." "Where will you live?" she asked softly, touched by this symbolic decision. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," he replied, suddenly hesitant again. "I've bought a house. Nothing as grand as the brownstone, but spacious and bright with a garden and a view of the Hudson. It's halfway between your community center and my offices." He took a photo from his pocket and handed it to her. Mary saw an elegant stone house with blue shutters, surrounded by trees and wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "I bought it, but I haven't moved in yet," Frank continued. "I wanted to ask you first, if you'd like to decorate it with me. Make it our home, a new beginning in a space that belongs neither to my past nor yours, but to our future. If you want one with me?" Mary felt tears come to her eyes at this proposal. Not a grandiose request, not a theatrical gesture, but a sincere invitation to build something together. "I'd love that," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. Frank smiled, the relief visible on his face. "I have another question," he said, pulling a small box from his jacket pocket. Mary looked at the box in surprise. "Frank, we're already married, remember?" He laughed softly, that free laugh she had come to know and love in these recent months. "I know. But we got married for all the wrong reasons. Family expectations, social appearances, my own fear of loneliness. I'd like to ask you again, this time for the only reason that matters." He opened the box, revealing not an ostentatious ring like the one he had given her during their first ceremony, but a simple gold band with a small emerald, the color of his eyes. "Mary Collins Bedford, would you renew our vows? Not in a cathedral full of strangers, but somewhere that has meaning for us, surrounded only by people we truly love. Would you start again with me? This time with full awareness of what we're committing to, with all our flaws and fears, but also with all our love. Mary looked at this man she had married as a stranger and had learned to love as a true partner. "Yes," she answered simply. "Yes, I will." Frank slipped the ring onto her finger next to the original wedding band, the past and future coexisting, like scars that heal but never completely disappear. That night, for the first time, they made love not as strangers sharing a bed, but as two people who had seen each other in their most vulnerable moments and loved each other despite everything, or perhaps precisely because of it. "I love you," Frank murmured in the darkness, the words he had never spoken before now flowing freely, as if a final barrier had been broken. "I loved you even when I pretended not to. Even when I was too afraid to admit it, even to myself." Mary traced the contours of his face in the darkness, memorizing by touch what she already knew by sight. "I know," she replied softly. "I always knew, somehow. That's why I could never leave completely." They fell asleep in each other's arms, their bodies and hearts closer than they had ever been, the past finally at peace, the future opening before them like a blank page waiting to be written. 6 months later, when Frank finally brought Mary to their new home by the Hudson, it was no longer strangers crossing the threshold, but two people who had learned to dance together through the shadows and light of true love. The house with the blue shutters had become their joint project, a tangible symbol of their renewed relationship. Each room reflected a different aspect of their journey. The library with a mix of both their favorite books, the warm kitchen where they learned together the art of cooking, the garden where Frank had planted roses and lilies side by side, like their once separate personalities now intertwined. They had renewed their vows 3 months earlier, in an intimate ceremony at the Greenwich Village Community Centre, surrounded only by people who truly mattered, the children and families from the centre, Elizabeth and Peter, a few real friends. Frank had donated a significant sum to renovate the centre, not as an ostentatious charitable gesture, but as a sincere recognition of the place where Mary had found purpose and where he himself had begun to learn the true meaning of value. That evening, as the sun set over the Hudson, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Mary and Frank stood on the terrace of their house, watching boats pass lazily on the shimmering water. "Do you remember that first night in the Hamptons?" Frank asked, embracing Mary from behind, his chin resting gently on her head. "When you asked me why I kept you at a distance?" Mary nodded, leaning against him, savoring the warmth of his body against hers, an intimacy that now seemed natural but had been so long out of reach. "I was terrified that night," he admitted. "Terrified because I knew that if I started to let you in, I could never go back to my comfortable solitude, that you would see all my flaws, all my scars." "And now?" she asked softly, turning in his arms to look at him. Frank smiled, that complete and unreserved smile she loved so much. "Now I know that's exactly what needed to happen, that true love isn't the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to embrace it fully." He took her face in his hands, with a tenderness that spoke of all the walls broken down, all the fears overcome. "You taught me that scars aren't something to hide, but evidence that we've survived, that we've grown. You showed me that loving means risking everything, but that it's the only risk truly worth taking." Mary felt tears come to her eyes, not tears of sadness as before, but tears of gratitude and deep joy. "We both have scars," she said softly. "But perhaps that's what makes our love stronger. It was forged in trial, tested by pain, and survived despite everything." Frank kissed her then, a kiss that contained their entire journey, the loneliness of the beginning, the pain of separation, the joy of reconciliation, and the promise of a shared future. Later that night, as they lay in their bed, the moonlight filtering through the curtains, drawing silver patterns on the sheets, Mary thought of that phrase she had read in one of Frank's never-sent letters. "Perhaps one day, I'll find the courage to love you openly." That day had finally come, not in a grand moment of revelation, but in the accumulation of small daily choices. The choice to speak rather than remain silent, to stay rather than flee, to trust rather than doubt. "What are you thinking about?" Frank murmured in the darkness, his hand finding hers under the covers. Mary smiled, intertwining their fingers. "I'm thinking that true love didn't come in a magical moment under the California sun. It came in daily choices, in conquered vulnerability, in walls torn down stone by stone. But when it finally arrived, it was stronger than any fantasy because it was built on truth, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. Frank drew her closer, planting a kiss on her forehead. "You know what my father always said about the best bottles of wine from our cellars?" "What?" "That it's not the easiest ones to produce that are the most precious, but those that have survived the difficult years, the frosts, the droughts, the storms. That these trials create a character, a depth that the easy years can never give." Mary smiled in the darkness. "So we're like a grand Bedford Cabernet?" Frank laughed softly, the sound vibrating against her chest. "Exactly. Aged to perfection, better with time and absolutely irreplaceable." On warm summer nights when they danced together in the inner courtyard to the sound of classical music, Mary knew she had found not only love, but a companion who had learned that the greatest courage was not to protect one's heart, but to give it completely. And when Frank looked at her, his green eyes bright with a love he no longer sought to hide, he knew he had finally understood the lesson his father had tried to teach him so many years ago, that true wealth is not measured in possessions or property, but in human connections, in shared moments, in the courage to love fully despite the risks. Their story wasn't perfect. It was made of false starts and second chances, of broken and healed hearts, of walls built and then patiently demolished. But it was their story, authentic, imperfect, and infinitely precious. Love is not the absence of fear, Mary often thought as she watched her husband fall asleep beside her, but the willingness to move forward despite it. And in this simple but profound truth, they had finally found their common home, not between stone walls by the Hudson, but in the vulnerable spaces of their hearts finally open to each other.